We now turn to what we're calling curricular planning. That is, the planning of curricula. As you can see down here, that's a plural. The singular is curriculum, and it refers to what's done in a whole program or sequence of subjects. Okay, so we would talk about a master's curriculum or an undergraduate curriculum, and the adjective is curricula with an R on the end. Okay, sorry about that. It's a Latin word, and we still sort of use it in the Latin way, at least with respect to the plural, in that it's like syllabus, as you can see. Anyway, in theory, once you've got your learning outcomes on the level of a curriculum, that should dictate what you do in it. And of course, it's all got to come back to the needs analysis at the beginning in the ideal world. But there are many, many issues involved on this level. Kelly does give us a view of different kinds of curricula. She looks at undergraduate programs. Sorry, programs is a general term that I tend to use at this level, which can be 3, 4, or in Spain we used to have 5-year undergraduate programs. Postgraduate can be 1 or 2, depending on the country and the tradition. Here it's 1.5. In the UK it's gone down to 1. In Europe there are many that are 2, and in the United States it tends to be 2. The curricula can be academic in some cases, training for university research work or teaching work, or vocational, and Kelly is very good actually on the mixes of vocational. Vocational means to get a job, okay? The kinds of mixes that go on in the various curricula. And she spends most of the chapter actually reviewing the competencies and trying to say how they should fit into the curriculum. That's of less interest to me here. I'm interested in what's missing. She doesn't talk about very short-term training, such as we would give to community interpreters or interpreters in the courts or in health services. We can give them training that could last a number of hours or a number of days. And she's not talking about quite a few online courses that are out there where you pay for each lesson, and if you study them and you do the exam, you get a professional certification of some kind. So there's lots of other things happening out there, especially online. And we should remember that training doesn't stop when you leave the university. In many, many situations, once you get into the workplace, you receive additional training there. And in some systems, like the United Nations system, you receive extensive training. As I might have mentioned, a translator employed by the United Nations is revised for 2 years. Everything they do in the first 2 years has to go through a reviser. You receive that feedback, and when you're good enough, then you can translate without being checked by the reviser. Okay, so there are many, many other aspects in training out there that are not generally dealt with under the heading of curricula. More generally, there is, at least in Europe, attention to lifelong learning, and I think in Australia, where once you're a professional, you are expected to keep getting additional training. Sometimes that goes on, I sometimes give a lecture. People from the industry are there, and they come up afterwards, and I have to sign a form to say they were at the lecture, because that counts as part of their continued training. Basic issues. Well, do we include language teaching? And here the answer is rather simple. This I've taken from Kelly. It's a 4-year program, undergrad. The first cycle is 2 years, the second cycle is 2 years. And you can see the basic distribution of the learning outcomes, if you like. Do you include language teaching? Absolutely. Language A, language B, language C. So the answer to that is here in Spain, at least. This is from the Spanish model. Yes, very much. And I should point out that translator training survived and has flourished in Spain, largely because we train people in A, B, and C languages. So we provide a lot of employment to the teachers of languages that are not English and Spanish. So all our French, Italian, German teachers are doing B and C training here, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, and we have managed to keep many of the modern language studies alive simply by incorporating 3 languages into the structure. In many other countries, it's just 2 languages. If it's undergrad, usually you do have language training because it's needed. At postgrad level, that's a more interesting question. Usually there's not enough time or space in the curriculum for a lot of language training, if it's not just incidental training. That is, you pick up lots of language training as you're doing translations and as you're doing area studies. I'm going to focus more on these basic questions. Where is interpreting with regard to written translation? When does that come in? How does it interact? Here you can see it's in the second cycle, okay? You're not going to get any interpreting in the first cycle, in the first 2 years. And then what happens is, if your marks are good, then you can go and do interpreting. If it's not so good, then you're going to be doing general or specialized, and you might look at specialized computing and terminology. Okay, so what you're looking at here is a classical Y structure. Everybody does the basic stuff, and then you branch out into one or the other, the interpreting or the written. What's the place of translation technology? Well, if we look here, where is the technology? It's down here, computing applied to translation, and I think terminology, perhaps specialized. It's very much towards the end. How much specialization should there be? Well, it's at the end here, and we don't really know what's in that specialized translation, and we don't really know if it requires you to learn, for example, take a subject in law if you're going to do legal translation, or in economics if you're doing economics translation. That is, do we include area studies? And then if we look at this, is there any work experience in it? On the face of it, no. And this one doesn't have it. It's very hard at undergrad level. Most, I don't know in the world, I can't say most, but in postgraduate training at master's level, there is a tendency to include work experience where it is possible. So I'm going to focus on those questions here. I'm not going to look at language teaching. I'm going to look at these particular questions, okay? And I'll just give some data on them, and that might help us. First one, with interpreting, okay? I just want to give an anecdote here. Most programs that include interpreting, this is the Y structure we just saw, basic translation, then some to written, some to interpreting. The orthodoxy is that you do consecutive interpreting and then simultaneous interpreting. And nobody really knows why. I once had a doctoral candidate who came to me and she wanted to do research on this. And she wanted to set up an experiment where half the group does simultaneous and then consecutive, and the other half does consecutive then simultaneous. And we applied for ethics clearance, ethics approval for this research. And it was denied because it was argued that if we reversed the traditional order, this could have adverse effects on the students' learning. That is, if we did simultaneous before consecutive, This would be disadvantageous to the students and therefore unethical. What this means is that because pure tradition has told us that consec is perhaps easier than simul, then we have to do it that way always, and we will never be able to check if it could be done in any other way. What I'm trying to get at here is that there is a weight of tradition within our structures, within the institutional structures of our programs, and that tradition becomes its own justification. It becomes very, very difficult to experiment with possible alternatives which might make actual sense. Okay? We've never been able to test the opposite. And that, for a long time, was true of this basic Y structure, okay, where nobody really questioned that. That was the way you had to do it. Now, what's interesting is that both, if you look at it at the level of learning outcomes, which is what we're supposed to do, both consecutive and simultaneous here require certain fundamental skills. Short-term memory, compression skills, and cross-lingual mapping skills, okay? And then the mode of delivery is different, the degree of compression is different, and note-taking is more important for consec than for simul, but exists in both. So I think that if you do the learning outcome analysis, you could find a lot of common ground there that suggests that it would not matter much which one you do first and which one you do second. What's even more interesting, though, is that these skills, the compression and cross-lingual mapping skills, are also needed in other areas. For example, when you teach subtitling, you're teaching compression skills. So we find that if you look at the actual skills involved, compression skills could be of use across the board. Now, if you look at it even more critically, the development of short-term memory is indeed for interpreting, okay? So we can have special activities for the interpreting at the end of the program, if that's where you want to put it. Compression skills, though, can be used in subtitling and indeed in all summary writing and the kinds of activities that we would use to get students to the point where they can extract the essential information from a text or work harder on the more important high-risk parts of a text and break with the initial literalism that they come into the programs with. And then cross-lingual mapping skills, that is happening in all translating. One consequence of this kind of analysis could be that the kinds of skills we use in spoken language work are fundamentally similar to what we use in written language, at least on these two levels. And we agree that special activities are needed to train interpreters, but spoken work can be used in all translation activities because the skills are fundamentally the same. This is my hobby horse. This is something I want to pursue in our training activities. You can look at it a different way, though. In France, in the University of Rennes, Daniel Guadec developed an undergraduate program where all students came in, and the first thing they would do for the first semester is write summaries of texts in their A language. So there's no cross-lingual work at all. They are simply learning how to write a summary of a text for a whole semester. And once they can do that correctly, that's once they can see that the text is communicating some things and they are more important than the rest, and a lot of the language in the text is not important and can be changed. Once they get that idea, then they can move on to technical translation, which is what his curriculum was specializing in. And Guadec was actually quite radical on that. once they go into specialized translation, there is no longer any classroom. Students are in teams. They're working on project work that could last for 1 week or two, and they can just do that work wherever they like, and they have to deliver it to the teacher, who therefore becomes a client. So a quite radical rethink, not just of the curriculum, although it starts at the curriculum level, but then that filters down to what the actual learning activities look like. Let me move on now to just to show you, just to show you. Here's what happens in most schools in the world, or at least the schools that are in the CIUT, which is an organization, a club of the institutions that think they are the most prestigious in the world. And what's interesting here is that translation is dominant. Most graduates have their degree in written translation. Interpreting is much less, and there is a fair percentage of curricula out there that allows students to do both interpreting and translation. Okay. Let me move on to technology. We saw in the Spanish model that technology is done at the end. And this seems logical because technology is difficult, right? Also, it requires computers, so the Spanish programs tend to have special computer labs where the students would go in to learn their CAT tools. All right? Now, I think that's entirely wrong. Why? Well, because of this. This is the Y model that we were seeing, consecutive and then simultaneous. And it meant that the technology was only for the written translators. Now, these days, interpreters use a lot of technology, especially for preparing glossaries and bringing up automatic glossaries and using machine translation where it's feasible. So they need the technology as well. But here is a more interesting development. This happened in Monterey, where I was teaching at the time, Monterey in California. We had the basic Y that you can see there with conference interpreting and written translation. And then, I think probably in 2004, 2005, I'll have to check the dates. And then they introduced a new master in localization and project management, basically because they were situated close to Silicon Valley and there were significant employment opportunities. Now, this meant that the technology was being done there. However, these people also need technology. So what happened in the course of a few years was rather interesting. The people who came in doing basic translation skills opted to go for conference interpreting if their grades were high, and localization and project management because the employment possibilities were much better. Very few students opted for written translation, which almost disappeared. Now, in that structure, what happened was that everybody needed technology, so it moved from there down to here. So everybody who came in to do the basic translation skills would all get the basic technology down here, and then these people up here could get specialized advanced training in project management tools, for example. The other thing that was obvious there was that if you're going to be a translator, you need a laptop, so we didn't need any special classrooms, and therefore everybody could do the basic translation skills, even in quite large groups. And as I said, advanced technology could be over here for project management, and you can give advanced technology for conference interpreting as well. Okay, so there's a radical rethink of the place of technology, but it's a rethink that has to be in terms of what your outcomes are and where your students are going to go. I've shown you this photograph before, I think, or something like it. I recommend, over the years, I have come to realize that all you need for technology is a big table and the ability to move around and do over-the-shoulder teaching. Let me move on to area studies. There are various names for this, okay? Complementary subjects. In the CUT survey that I referred to, they're called complementary subjects. But you can see over here what we're talking about. Students who took subjects in law, for example, or in economics, or in civil engineering, or in technology, psychology, medicine, as part of their training. Now, the authors of that survey, 2014, were quite scandalized, actually. 45% had no training in a complementary subject. And in their report, they say, officially, we are supposed to be offering this training to all graduates, so that if you're going to be translating economics, for example, you should have studied some economics. Now, what we find happening is that often some programs do offer electives. So you can go out and at the University of Melbourne, you can select electives. Often the list of electives does not include these hardcore basic, Law 101 is not on our menu. But if you think about it, it could be if we are doing or giving training in legal translation. If we have a subject that's specializing in legal translation, can we allow you then to do an elective in law so you get the basics of law? Why not? An alternative, though, is to integrate some of the legal training into what we do in the activities. So where this is institutionally difficult, often because we're in different faculties and it's hard to get cross-faculty cooperation, another solution that has been used quite successfully is tandem project work. So, for example, this was first done, I think, by Kathy Way in Granada. She got a major legal translation project, and she had translation students working on it together with students from the Faculty of Law. So the translation students would make the future lawyers aware of language problems and how to work with translators and interpreters, at the same time as the law students taught the translation students about law and about the legalities and about how the functions of a lawyer and how a courtroom operates. So that is really quite exciting, and I think personally, rather than insist that all students go out and do fundamental courses in other faculties, I'm really, really interested in developing more tandem project work like this. And I know my university in Spain, in our master's program, we are doing this again with the law faculty, which seems an almost natural place for cooperation. It could be extended to other areas as well, to economics, if you like, and to health services. I would like to also talk about the place of work experience, and then there are many, many terms for this. The CUT survey talks about internships, and that's the term used in the United States. Others talk about work placements. European Union terminology calls it secondments, which I've never figured out as a term, but that's the one they use. Here at the University of Melbourne, we talk about work integrated learning, or WIL, which is a more general concept, and I think healthily so. There seems little doubt that the incorporation of work experience, here internship because it's in Europe, is regarded as being very helpful in order to find employment. So this is from an EMT survey. It's over 1,000 respondents to this question, and you've got quite a few countries there. You'll find that it's variable according to the country, but the very useful or quite useful is mostly dominant. Okay, so they are found to be of practical use by students. These are students who are then graduates who are working, reporting on whether or not the work experience in their training helped them get a job. Work placements are not done everywhere, and there are reasons for this. Primarily, it is difficult to organize if you have a large cohort or a large group of students. It's difficult to assess in academic terms because anything can happen out there, and it depends very much on who the employer is and what kind of work they are doing there. And it is open to exploitation. Because in many cases you go out there, you put into a workplace and you're working alongside people who are getting paid, but you are not getting paid, or you're not getting paid very much. Now, I think there are solutions to all these problems, and I think we should be pursuing them. It's difficult to organize, yes. I know at Monterey there were two solutions there. Students were able to find their own employment. And I know in my work in Spain, often that works very well because they've got contacts in the local industries. And in many cases, they'd been working there anyway. That we had lots of working translators who came in for training in technology. So that was easy. And then you develop networks of alumni, of former students, of graduates who are working in industry. Often they like to stay in touch with the training institution, and often they like to employ or give work experience to the students. This very much was the case in Monterey, which had a very well-developed network with medical institutions, with Stanford hospitals, for example, and the head of localization at Google was a graduate of the school. And they know that the students at that institution do have very strong language skills and translation skills, and therefore they come looking for future employees. So this works well. When it works well, it works very well, both for the student who gains employment, and often that becomes their first job, and for the employer who can get a good look at their future employees and pick the one or ones that they want. I know we did one study on a translation company in Barcelona, and all their employees, all the translators and revisers and technologists working there in-house, had all come from the same translation program in Barcelona. And they had all come in through work placements. So, difficult to organize, yes. Impossible, no. And when it works, it can work very well. Difficult to assess, absolutely, because of the enormous variability. The only way to do it, I think, is through students writing up self-reports on what happened, what problems surfaced, and how well they solved those problems. And there are surveys of employer satisfaction, but the employers are very different, and their mindset is not into assessing for educational purposes. So I tend to put more weight on self-reporting by the student than surveys of employer satisfaction. And then the final problem, yes, there is a possibility of exploitation, and we are all aware of that. I took this from a campaign in Australia in the arts industry, where the art students were just upset about not being paid at all. Pay your interns. The only solution for the institution is to check on the offerings, get the student input and feedback every year, and see when payment is possible, and when it's possible, is it correct? Does it concord with the actual work done? At the moment, in most places in the world, we cannot insist that the students are paid for their work placement activities, but we can hope that it is done more and more. With that, I hope I've given you an overview of some of the problems in curricular development.